As I mentioned at the very beginning of our service tonight, this is Shabbat Nachamu, this Shabbat of consolation. And what is it consoling, and what does the prophet Yeshayahu or Isaiah talk about that we'll repeatedly examine through these 7 weeks? How do we deal with what we went through for the 3 weeks from the 17th of the month of Tammuz to the 9th of Av, which was yesterday? There are these 3 weeks, we call them Bein Hamtzarim, the days of constriction, the days in between. The Bein of this between the 17th of Tammuz and the 9th of Av, the 3 weeks of constriction. When the Romans started attacking Jerusalem on the 17th of Tammuz, the walls were breached in the north, and the Romans came through the walls, and in 3 weeks they were able to destroy the temple in the army attacking Jerusalem. And so in those 3 weeks, we watched this increasing sense of attack to this destruction. Now, I know we talk about this often, but not many of us in this room are dreaming of the rebuilding of the temple and the reinstatement of animal sacrifice. But you should know there are people in Jerusalem who are, and who are actively hoping that that temple will get rebuilt, that the Muslim centers of holiness on the Har HaBayit will be destroyed, and they are actively practicing and preparing for it, sewing the clothes for the priests to wear, making sure they're studying the laws of sacrifice so they'll be able to reinstate animal sacrifice. And those people are very well represented by the current government of the State of Israel. So there are people who are praying very much, and for them, Tisha B'Av, these 3 weeks of Av, these 3 weeks, the Bein Hamtzarim weeks, are seen quite literally, and there's profound hope that what this means is that the Jewish people is being punished because of people like us and the secular Israeli Jews who do not observe. And so why is God punishing Jews right now, and don't have access to the Temple Mount? The story is told is because of people like us, LGBT Jews, secular Israelis. To call somebody in modern Hebrew a Reform Jew is almost as bad as calling them a leftist in modern Hebrew. And these are things that Bibi Netanyahu for the last 20 years has really been a leader in creating that energy. There's so many negative things that we can say, the list is long. And this current government that we have been talking about any number of times, and yesterday we had a briefing with Rabbi Noah Satat, who's the executive director of the Association for Civil Rights in Israel, and the recording is now available, and we will make it available for those who would like it, is that this is a neon sign moment in history, not unlike what we're going through here in the United States. It is not unlike, and for anybody who thinks it's really somehow some very different animal, there are cultural differences and unique elements, but it is not at all fundamentally different. There is a cadre of largely religious people who are using the grievances of people who have been left behind in society to create an energy to replace democratic institutions using the democracy with which they have manipulated to their own enrichment. This story is being told over and over again around the world. There is a special flavor to it in Israel, and a very special flavor here in the United States, because we are really aware here in the United States of how anti-Semitism uses anti-Israel rhetoric and activism. And so how are we who care so deeply, and I speak for myself, about the dream of Israel, but not in a Disneyland way, but in an Efrat Meir kind of way, in a hand-in-hand kind of way, in a Rabbi Noah Satat, the Association for Civil Rights in Israel kind of way, in the fact that hundreds of thousands of Israelis are protesting in the streets in a way that we in the United States have never experienced. People say to me, well, what about the occupation? So, Jason, can we show some of these slides? I have found that in trying to explain Israel to American Jews, it's very difficult. So the first thing I want to show is a slide which will go down in Jewish history for thousands of years. God willing, there will be Jewish history in thousands of years. This past Monday, a vote was taken, which is the first of several votes to dismantle the Supreme Court's independence and power in Israel. And as you've heard me say either yesterday or other times, in a country in which there's no constitution and no separation of church and state and no powers, the Supreme Court is the only center in which there's any protection of human rights. And by the way, it's not been so great, but it is the only place. And the current government, which 29 weeks ago came into power, has set a very clear agenda. It actually came into power in a little bit before that, but 29 weeks ago made this very clear agenda public about what its agreements were to create the government of Israel. And one of those was the dismantling of the Supreme Court, which has been the only place where there's been any protections of Palestinian rights, LGBT rights, women's rights. When this vote went through on Monday, which there's been hundreds of thousands, the equivalent of 15 million Americans in the street this past Sunday. Think of that. 15 million Americans in the street. The scale of this protest has never been seen in human history. This is the largest protest in the world today and the largest protest in human history. Absorb that for a moment. And I say this to my friends who are deeply anti-Zionist, and I have many, and respect that position, that our job is to stand with those who are trying to create a different reality. It's easy to put your hands up and to run away. It's harder to figure out how to support those elements that are there for the good. 15 million Americans in the street on Sunday, 600,000, the equivalent of 600,000 Americans walked spontaneously from Tel Aviv in the heat like today, here in New York, in this kind of heat, walked 3 days, the 50 miles from Tel Aviv uphill. By the way, remember, Jerusalem goes uphill, which is why, by the way, it's a lot cooler in the summertime. But Tel Aviv walked 50 miles, 3 days, camping out, and here's pictures of the march from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And hold that for a second. And it just was spontaneous, and people gathered and gathered and gathered and camped along the road and took over the highway, started on the shoulder, then took over one lane and then another to arrive in Jerusalem, set up a tent city in the Gan Saker, which is below, very close to the Knesset. And they set up a tent city to house everybody, and people slept overnight, again in this tremendously painful heat, though Jerusalem's a little better. The next slide, Jason. These are some images of the march from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Next one. These are continued slides. It says, Netanyahu, clear and present danger to Israeli democracy. And this is some of the protests that took place. Let's go back to the first slide first. Sorry, Jason. So after the vote took place on the Knesset floor, by the way, the head of security, the chief of staff of Netanyahu, asked to do a briefing with him before the vote to explain the threat to Israeli security if this vote went through. And Bibi, the prime minister of the state of Israel, refused to meet with his key security advisors before the vote. The vote took place, and instead of a sense of how do we bridge the gap that we have created, I'm saying the people in this picture, they took a selfie. They recited Shehechianu, and they took this selfie, and in this picture, the guy with the white kippah kind of facing away from us, but you see the white kippah? Could not be in the government 20 years ago because he's such a racist that he wasn't even allowed to run for Knesset. He is now a leader in the government. I keep looking for ways to explain to Americans to understand. Imagine Marjorie Taylor Greene in a leadership position in a government in which Trump is president. Imagine David Duke or the KKK having a party that's actually in the government. It's hard to really get how horrible these people are. And this is after the vote took place, and then this are the protests that started taking place immediately afterwards. 10,000 reservists who are the older men who are in the reserve duty and are in reserve duty for some years after their active duty is over have said they won't show up to their reserve duty, which is annual. And depending on the unit they're in, the frequency depends on the unit they're in, and if they're pilots, they go off much more often than the other units. And hundreds of pilots have said they will not show up for reserve duty because of this law. This law is the first step. It is not even the worst of them, but Israeli public understands. And people say to me, well, what about the occupation? Is the Israeli public also protesting the occupation? And here's my answer to that. There is a large anti-occupation bloc in the demonstration. Randy and I were there when we were there in April. We marched with, they have a huge bloc of the anti-occupation bloc, and it's growing. But do most liberal Israeli Jews do a lot about the occupation on a day-to-day basis? Do they think about it a lot? No, they think about it as much as most liberal Americans think about racism or do anything about racism. It's a feature of society that they have felt hopeless about changing. When we're critical that this protest has not yet totally transformed the Israeli, Jewish, and Arab relationship, think about how many liberal Jews, think about how many of us in this room take on racism every single day of our life. We know it's evil. How much do we do every day to really dismantle racism? We all agree, right? So that's an obvious one. And much of that is true. The question is, will this protest help people connect the dots? Can democracy exist for Israeli Jews inside of the Green Line if it doesn't exist for Palestinians in the West Bank? And the dots are starting to get connected precisely because of maps like this. This is a map of where the protests against the government took place. So you can see those the red dots are where the buses gathered to take people for the pro-fascist government demonstrations. All of those are inside the West Bank. So it's from the settler communities inside the West Bank getting onto buses to go inside the Green Line, and the blue are all outside, or they're all inside the state of Israel, inside the Green Line. Those are where all the protests are taking place. So you see, it's a complete mirror image. It's a little bit like us looking at the states of the Confederacy and understanding who's voting for the anti-abortion, anti-LGBT, anti-trans stuff. And I think the dots are starting to get connected. How we can help that happen and work on that? Well, we are lucky to have people like Efrat Be'ir and Noah Satat doing the work they're doing on the ground every day. But let's go back to the slide of that protest, Jason. Actually, that's a good map. So this is a map because most American Jews don't really understand the map of Israel. The green line you see drawn there towards the river, it's hard to do this without a little PowerPoint, a little thingamajigger, right? The darker image, surrounded by the green line, is the West Bank. That's where millions of Palestinians live under military occupation since 1967. The Israeli government denies them all civil rights, and they are governed mostly by a very ineffective and powerless and corrupt Palestinian Authority. Most Palestinians hate the Palestinian Authority because they have no power. They don't really have any power to do anything. The Jewish settlements, which are inside that area, initially, by the way, in 1967, and some of us remember 1967, the assumption was this territory would be given back because it had 1 million Palestinians living there. And slowly, that didn't happen that's a long story, and some of you have taken my class on the history of this conflict. But now we have a situation where there are several million Palestinians living there, and now probably 500,000, approaching 1 million settlers. And many of the people in that initial picture that you saw taking the selfie and saying the Shechianu are settlers themselves. And as it's said now, this is a government not just listening to the settler movement, but actually run by the settler movement. So I think personally that the dots are starting to get connected by a lot of Israeli Jews. Not all, and that becomes a big challenge. But every time you think, oh my God, how come there isn't more of that in this protest movement? Think about how we are and how the American community is in dealing with racism. But it is a large anti-occupation movement. The question is, what will come next? Randy and I met with a woman activist, Israeli Jewish activist in a moshav right next to the Gaza Strip, which is, some of you have been on our trips and have gone to this moshav called Netiv HaAsara, which had been in the north of Sinai originally. And she said to us, in the words of your famous folk singer, Pete Seeger, ultimately, this land is your land, this land is my land. This land was made for you and me. That there are two peoples that are not going to leave. How do we create a world in which two peoples can coexist? What will it look like? One government, two governments, one state, two states, three states, as Efrat said. The question is, do we create enough support for two peoples to live in peace? We American Jews have a very important role to play. The pressure we put on our government is important. The voices we bring out, the ways we speak about it, and we do not run away. Most non-Orthodox synagogues in America have stopped even talking about Israel. It's just too complicated. The left, and I consider myself a part of the left, and I'm in this debate all the time, has said Israel is just treif at this point. It's so hostile to Palestinians. There is no future for supporting the state of Israel. You know, I'm a person who, like Efrat, I believe in the optimism of education. I believe in the optimism of believing the impossible. It doesn't mean it's going to happen even in our generation. But people who believe in the impossible help to lay the foundation for that to happen. So let us be a community that continues to absolutely denounce the theocratic dictatorship that many in this Israeli government want to become. And let us not be mistaken, the same forces that fund those same people here in the United States are funding what's happening in Israel right now. It's right-wing Jewish money and it's evangelical Christian money who are funding this right-wing settler movement in Israel. It's right-wing American Jewish money that's buying a lot of that land, and it's right-wing American Jewish money that's making it possible. And to my shame, the progressive Jewish world has not responded with the same level of generosity. We need to continue doing that.